Welcome back. In this video, we're going to take a look at that congressman who started out as little known and became the most famous president, arguably, in the history of the United States. And that, of course, is Abraham Lincoln. To give you a context for him, he was born in 1809 in the days of Thomas Jefferson, and he died in 1865. He was famously assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., just days after Robert E. Lee had surrendered. Now, Lincoln is a curious individual. He's someone who actually has had more books written about him than most other modern characters. In fact, he probably is the person who has the most books, the most movies, the most films and documentaries done about him in all of American history, much more so than even George Washington. But the thing about Lincoln is a very complex figure. He's someone who has sometimes very differing views on the same issue, and someone who is often quite misunderstood. So what we're going to try and do in this lesson and the next is try and unpack the character and the beliefs and the life of Lincoln and give him a fair picture as best as we can, especially with how he fits in American history. Now, Lincoln's beginnings are rather humble. In fact, he came from a very poor family in Kentucky, in rural Kentucky for that matter, and when he was asked by a biographer to explain his early childhood, he said that one sentence would describe it. He actually quoted the old poet Thomas Gray by saying, "My life was the short and simple annals of the poor." Indeed it was. His father was somebody who was probably illiterate. He could not read. His mother came from an illegitimate family. Her parents were not married, so she had kind of grown up with the stigma around her. But yet she was someone who took great kindness upon her son, as all mothers do, and she actually taught him to read. In fact, really instilled that love of learning in the young Abraham Lincoln. However, she died when he was only 9 years old. And Lincoln and his father, by most accounts, were not always on the best terms with each other. But one thing his father did give him was a real appreciation of a work ethic. And the way that he did this was he hired Lincoln out regularly to help pay the family's bills. And so Lincoln, as a young man, actually learned several frontier skills when his father would hire him out to various people within the county. For example, he learned everything from rafting and boat making to carpentry to butchering to forestry, to how you actually construct a fence, or storekeeping, or brewing, or distillation, actually the creation of certain alcoholic drinks. Now, all these things may seem wide and varied, but they were all essential frontier skills in those days. Eventually, Lincoln, who always had this love of things written, really saw the power of the word as being something very important, as it always has been, taught himself the grammar of English. In fact, got a little English grammar, worked through it until he understood everything. He eventually went on and would actually trade book after book as he read them. He read everything from Aesop's Fables to Pilgrim's Progress to Robinson Crusoe to Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which is a rather thick work, and even things such as the biographies of George Washington or Benjamin Franklin. And most famously, he read the Statutes of Illinois, the actual series of laws that the state of Illinois had passed at that time, and they say that he memorized most of them because he knew them by heart. Lincoln had incredible gifts. For example, he was a natural storyteller. He was the kind of man that when he told a tale, people stopped and they listened. He was also someone who was very witty. He always had a response to give. He's kind of like Winston Churchill or Ronald Reagan in that regard. He was also someone who often kept notes about what he was thinking or about what he was planning to do. And people who knew him well or who cleaned up after him, such as his wife, for example, from time to time, would find notes throughout his pockets, throughout the drawers of his desk, on various tables and various areas of the house regularly. But he was somebody who kept all the information organized in his mind. He may write it down, but he typically didn't come back to those. He, of course, in terms of his physique, was very tall. He was lanky. He was known for his great strength. They said that he could pick up an entire barrel that was full of some heavy liquid with a single arm and lift it from the floor to the table or to the countertop. He was also somebody who often struggled with things like depression, actually finding his way in this world and finding a meaning to this life. In fact, he wrote famously in his journal that he didn't carry a knife with him because he was afraid he might harm himself with it. So Lincoln really is a very complex man. Of course, the thing about Lincoln is he's known for his honesty. He's actually nicknamed Honest Abe, as you've probably heard in the past. And indeed, he was. In fact, he became a storekeeper early on in his life, had a partner. Together, they went into debt, some $1,100 into debt, which was a significant amount of money back in those days. And this debt was something that they intended to pay off with the profits from the store. There was just one problem. His partner ran away with much of the money, and Lincoln really had little dealing with him afterwards. Still, instead of going and trying to get out of the debt or just running away himself, Lincoln famously kept the store going, eventually would practice law as well, but he would pay off the debt. And of course, stories are told about how somebody left spare change on the counter and Lincoln would run after them for miles to hand back the spare change. Those stories, even though they sound legendary, are largely true. In fact, as a lawyer, he became one of the best paid lawyers in all of Illinois, at one point earning 3 times the amount of money in a single year that the Illinois governor earned. But he was also known there for his honesty. There were times where he would actually be given a sum of money to take a case, and he would say, "No, you've paid me too much for the amount of work here," and he would give the refund back. But he was also very just, so that if he was hired to take a case and he thought he was being paid too little for the amount of work, he would tell them, "Listen, if you want me to complete this work, you must pay more." So one of the things I love about Lincoln is, yes, he was honest, but honesty doesn't always mean that you sacrifice justice. He was someone who thought about what a fair price for things actually should look like. Now, in terms of his marriage, Lincoln, who was married to Mary Todd, did not actually pursue her first. In fact, there was a woman by the name of Anne Rutledge who Lincoln first fell in love with and intended to marry. However, she died of the disease typhoid. And so it was sometime after that Mary Todd, who came from a wealthy family, actually pursued Lincoln in many ways, and Lincoln eventually agreed and promised that he would marry her. However, from what we can tell about the relationship, there wasn't really a whole lot of love there. It was one of the great disappointments in Lincoln's life. In fact, at the very first time he was supposed to marry her, the service was ready. People were there. The pastor was up front with Mary Todd, and Lincoln did not show up. He left her at the altar. But realizing that he'd given a promise, when they had a second service, he showed up to that one and did indeed marry her. Lincoln, who was kind of messy and known for being kind of loose and very casual, really contrasts with Mary Todd, who was rather high-strung, rather formal. In fact, when guests used to come over to the Lincoln house and Mary Todd wasn't down yet, Lincoln would say to the guest, "Oh, please excuse my wife, she'll be down soon, just as soon as she gets her trotting harness on." In other words, he thought of her sometimes as being like a high-strung horse. Even so, by the year 1847, Lincoln had successfully won a seat in the U.S. Congress and was actually a representative for the state of Illinois. It was in that election that he ran under the Whig Party. That was the party, for example, of Henry Clay. And it's famous, again, showing his honesty. He was given $200 to use in expenses for his campaign. At the end of the campaign, he returned $199.25 because he had only purchased a 75-cent barrel of cider to be used at one of his political rallies. Even so, in this very first election, and actually an election that he had run in prior to this, Lincoln revealed his view of government. For example, Lincoln revealed that he was somebody who stood for the tariff. He believed the government should actually impose that tax upon all imports to protect the industries of this home country. The problem is, when you interfere with the free market like that, somebody, both abroad and in your own nation, will always suffer. He also believed that the United States government, as well as state governments, should subsidize railroads. They should pay money to actually make certain that railroads and canals went forward. The problem, of course, with this is that it made the government in business, which the government really doesn't do business very well. He also promoted a national bank as a way to control the supply of money. He really believed that money should not be backed by things like gold and silver, but that money should simply be controlled by people's faith in the government. This is called fiat money, which is the way our money works to this day. He even went so far to say about things such as trade, things as this: I would continue trade where it is necessary, and I would discontinue trade where it is not. For example, I would continue trade so far as it employed, say, bringing us coffee, and I would discontinue it so far as it employed bringing us cotton goods. In other words, he argued that the government was really the best factor for deciding what kind of trade should actually happen. This made him a radically different president. Well, eventually he would become president, and a radically different congressman even than many of the politicians or statesmen who had arisen to this level before. Now, it's curious, one of his first moves in Congress was a draft to abolish slavery. In fact, this bill, which of course did not pass, was a very unique stamp on Lincoln's actual character. Lincoln was consistently against slavery his entire life. In fact, he argued that slavery was ridiculous because slavery made you the slave of someone who essentially had lighter skin than you did. In other words, he looked at Africans being enslaved by European Americans, and he said, it doesn't make any sense because you base it upon skin color. By the same logic, someone who is fairly tan could be enslaved by someone who has fairly fair skin. He found that whole logic to be very ridiculous. Lincoln was also someone who would oppose, while he was in Congress, the Mexican War. He saw it as a violation of the rights of Mexico, and himself was a consistent proponent of the whole idea of revolution, because after all, the revolutions in Europe over the release of Karl Marx's ideas of communism were occurring in that year of 1848. In fact, Lincoln had this to say about revolutions: any people, anywhere, being inclined and having the power, have the right to rise up and shake off the existing government and form a new one that suits them better. This is a most valuable, a most sacred right, a right which we hope and believe is to liberate the world. So he really did have a distinctively different view about things like revolution, things such as government and justice, than the Founding Fathers did, who took years to declare independence only after they had tried everything else first. Lincoln really saw revolution as a fundamental right, and he really saw the national government as being the greatest organizing force for good in this world. Those are key ideas you have to keep in mind as we study this complex figure of Abraham Lincoln, who is still Honest Abe.